Hi everyone, my name is Julia. I'm 19 years old. I'm from Germany, and I also took a gap year. And today I want to talk about communication. So, do you remember a situation where you were misunderstood or your voice wasn't being heard? Communicating with others has always been a big part of my identity. On this trip, my way of communicating was challenged, and I had to learn there are many constructive ways of conveying your ideas and emotions. When I embarked on the trip, I was ready to learn. I was ready to meet new amazing people, create amazing friendships, live in completely new environments, and get to know very different cultures. However, I was not prepared to communicate who I was, my German culture, and my identity in a different language. While I knew that speaking English for the next 7 months was going to be challenging, I didn't think that the cultural difference among my fellow travelers and I was going to be so big. I have a fairly similar lifestyle to most of the people in my group at home in Germany. I live in a big city, listen to similar music, more to that later, and took similar classes in school. But one of the biggest culture shock I had, ironically enough, was with American culture. When I say that I acknowledge that the group's culture doesn't equal American culture, just as I don't equal German culture. However, that is how I felt at the time. But let's start at the beginning. When I arrived at the Miami airport, I met up with the group for the first time. It was 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. In Germany, it was 4 a.m. So I was tired, nervous, and I couldn't really express myself. It was hard for me to engage in the first group's conversation that were mostly about getting to know you. Once I had an idea what I wanted to say and how I wanted to express it in English, the conversation had long moved on. So I was perceived as fairly shy in the beginning. And this is not something how my friends at home would describe me. On the third day, I wrote in my journal, the language and the culture is challenging sometimes. Everyone talks about the different states they're from and their characteristics. I couldn't engage in these conversations. And every now and then, I can't exactly say the things I would have liked to say in German, but I think that will get better as time passes by. And I was right. I could say almost everything I wanted to say, and it started to become easier to engage in small talk about American topics. The more I shared about my experience at home, and the more I got to know about American culture. But there are some topics that came up that I had never dealt with in my life. I remember that one night in Mindo, I had a conversation with a few girls, and they all started talking about college rape culture and binge drinking, and that they were afraid to encounter those things next year in college. While these things do happen in Germany too, my friends and I at home never discussed these issues before because no one had a personal experience with that. In that instance, I didn't speak up because I couldn't understand the situation enough to give any advice. I also didn't want to stay silent because the way I process experience and reflect is by talking about them. I was so surprised. This was fairly new for me. This was all during orientation week. One of the most important aspects of orientation was to help prepare the group on the importance of understanding and adapting to other cultures. I was ready to engage with and learn from the host communities. I was beginning to find my place in the group, but I wasn't aware of the challenge communication would be for the group. One of the first learning experiences I had where my communication style was perceived as different was the first time we were in Quito. The PL sat us down and told us they felt disrespected by the group. To contribute to the conversation, I tried to offer constructive feedback on how I felt in the group. After the conversation, members of the group came up to me and told me that I was so bold and very direct to provide that feedback. To me, this was how I was used to communicating. If I had a problem, I would try and solve it, usually by talking about it with the people involved in the situation. I never saw myself as particularly direct. It eventually got back to me that within the group, I was considered as too direct and not polite enough. As most of you probably know, we had to share 4 computers among 16 students. With limited Wi-Fi and everyone wanting to talk with their parents, this was a very difficult task. Quickly, a system formed of waiting in line for computers, sometimes for hours. I was perceived as too direct and impolite because instead of asking if anyone was in line for the computer, I would ask for it directly. I felt misunderstood. This was the way my parents and my culture taught me to communicate, but because I thought I was the only one who had this struggle in the group, I felt like I had to adjust. Looking back, I think I was not the only one who felt misunderstood. I think many of us would have liked to clarify misunderstandings, but no one knew how to. I felt alone with this at the time and blamed it on the cultural difference, when it really wasn't. And while my struggle within it was still unique, it wasn't until later on in the trip that I realized it wasn't just a cultural difference creating miscommunication. It was also personal differences and the very special situation of traveling with each other for so long. Part of my unique struggle was that some words which exist in English don't exist in German, and vice versa. Therefore, I got new labels put on my identity and lost others. A new word I learned on this trip was basic. For those who don't know it, it describes the stereotypical or mainstream millennium girl. Because things that are mainstream right now are Justin Bieber, Ugg boots, or Instagram. And because I like some of these things, I was labeled as basic. This new identity was given to me. At home, my friends would make fun of me because I like Justin Bieber, but they wouldn't put a label on it. And I'm telling you right now, I'm much more. There's much more to my personality than Justin Bieber or Instagram. One thing I had a hard time doing on this trip was playing with the language. That was something I really missed. Just to give one example, my last name in German, Wünsche, means wish, and my friends at home used to make fun of that. When I wanted to make fun of myself in that way, no one understood what I meant. That's when I realized the misunderstanding wasn't just a one-way street. Language was a challenge to our first host community as well. We lived with an indigenous tribe. Their language, Safiki, was tied very closely to their culture. Most of the words were connected to nature because that's all they needed to describe to each other 85 years ago. Now they're struggling to keep their culture in the modern world, and the more their language fades, the more their culture does too. My host mother would sometimes struggle to explain the meaning of some Safiki words in Spanish because there were no words to describe it. It was interesting to see that the same thing occurs comparing German and English. In Ecuador, I experienced my first struggle communicating my identity. I wasn't quite comfortable with the new labels I got and with the new way I was supposed to communicate. I didn't know how I would be able to adapt and change. In Thailand, I experienced a new way of communication. During orientation in Thailand, we learned about the Thai way of communication. It's important to acknowledge that within that culture, everyone has their own unique way of communicating, but there are general norms around communication different from the American or German way of talking to each other. We learned that in Thai culture, there are 2 types of people. People who are described as Jayan and people who are described as Jairan. Jayan means mild temper, chill, relax, not easily upset. Jairan means passionate, hasty, hot-tempered, and unpredictable. In Thai culture, we learned it was more esteemed to be Jayan, chill. But why? Because the #1 goal of Thai society is to preserve social harmony. The way you do it is by being indirect, so you can save your face. I want to give one example. One day, Sean was watching a movie with Rachel, Zizu, and I in our room. Our host mother was uncomfortable with it, and instead of telling us directly, she told our translator Pijiev, and Pijiev told Stephen, and then Stephen told Sean, and then Sean told us. This indirect way of communication was in place to keep the social harmony. I personally would have preferred if she would have told me directly what she was feeling. That way I could have explained to her that Sean was only watching a movie in there, but in the future this will not happen again, and I'm sorry that I made her feel uncomfortable. In my host mother's eyes, she just wanted to pass along the message. So we would not do this again, and she didn't need to justify anything. For her, we could just move on with our lives, pretend it never happened, and keep the social harmony in the household. Even though it was something I had to get used to, I realized there was a value in that type of communication. There was no confrontation, but the message was received and the problem was solved. After being perceived as being too direct and too bold and trying to adjust to new ways of communication, I felt like I lost part of my voice and who I was. I soon realized that instead of confronting people directly on how I felt about issues or problems, I would just tell other people instead. The only problem was that our group had not mastered the art of indirect communication for social harmony like the Thai culture. So in the end, problems were never solved and more miscommunication was created. Coming on the trip, I thought that being direct would solve every problem. This was the first time I was confronted with new ways of communication. One that worked really well and prevented miscommunication, and another that created some miscommunication. I thought being indirect wouldn't get anything done. I was wrong. As we saw in the example of my Thai host family, a lot of things can be done in that kind of manner. In India, the culture behind communication was vastly different. My host family, and especially my host uncle, preserved social harmony through a very direct way of communication. He was aware that this was unique to his culture, so every time we would eat, and he would ask my roommate Hannah and me if we'd like the food, and we would say yes, he would say, "I don't believe you. You're just trying to be polite through your indirect way of communication." It became really hard sometimes to convince him of how I felt because he would always think I would only say things to make him feel good. At some times, it felt liberating to be able to say my opinion out loud and someone actually appreciating my directness. But at other times, I also felt uncomfortable. Not just because I couldn't tell him how much I liked the food, but also because he would make statements like, when I went to Germany, I would ask people, "Do you like Hitler?" They always said no, but I could see a spark in their eyes, a spark of excitement and pride. Do you feel that too? First of all, I didn't know what to say to that question besides, no, I don't feel that. And yeah. But while I appreciated his honesty, that level of directness was hurtful. And although I respected his opinion, I didn't see the reason he had to share this with me, especially when he knew I would disagree with him and also feel uncomfortable talking about this topic. I used to appreciate any form of directness. I would think that it sometimes would hurt more in the moment, but in the end, all things are better said out loud. In India, I learned that being direct in your communication can be effective, but can also be ineffective and hurtful. In South Africa, most people are at least bilingual. At the organization we worked with, everyone had to speak English, but most people's first language was either Afrikaans or Xhosa. Sometimes the caregivers wouldn't follow this rule, which led to tension between these two groups of people. But at the end, it was important for everyone to have that common ground of language and communication. This was the only way everyone would be able to work together constructively. I learned that language can bring people closer together, but it can also separate. But what did that mean to me? In South Africa, I had the opportunity to see my best friend from Germany in Cape Town. There are two things I noticed. First, it was so liberating to be able to speak my mother tongue again. I didn't realize how much I missed being witty and how much I missed playing with the language. One of my friends in the group noticed that without even understanding what my German friend and I were talking about, and that literally brought me to tears. Was I really so different speaking English? The other thing was that I asked her if she would describe me as remarkably direct. She said no. So, did I get a new identity on this trip? Even though I got some new labels on this trip, I wouldn't say I lost my old identity. Understanding how I wanted to communicate was a process, and maybe at times I lost my voice. The way we communicated in the group made me reflect on my way of communicating. Everyone has their own way of talking with each other, and that is a huge part of everyone's unique identity. Accepting that and being understanding is one of the most important things. To figure out why someone communicates the way they do can help a great deal to emphasize with them. While it's important to be understanding, it is also important to find common ground within a group. Have certain rules around communication would help with misunderstandings. Usually these rules are unspoken rules. For example, being truthful is expected of me. With not truthful, I don't mean lying. I mean not telling people how you feel about certain things. If I would just stop being truthful tomorrow because I didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, there would be a lot of miscommunication. In the future, when I'll be part of another group again, I'll be more cautious of these rules. I'll try to find common factors and see which rules don't apply or do apply to my way of communicating. But I will also try to share my way of communication and why it is so important to me. Living in the host family opened up my eyes to different types of communication that work. I not only learned from that, I also learned how to put my way of communicating aside, to fully embrace the new culture. As globalization moves on, further and further, cross-cultural communication becomes more important. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I know that for that type of communication, you need to know the language and their way of communicating. Communication is such a big part of everyone's identity that if you want to understand a culture, you have to understand and embrace the way they communicate. For myself, I learned to sometimes step aside. Before this trip, I thought the only way to not have any misunderstandings was through my way of talking to people. But I learned that sometimes you can be too direct and hurt someone's feelings, and other times things are better said out loud and solved directly. I learned to first observe and let other people speak up, and I learned that it sometimes is important to ask questions instead of composing the answers. To be mindful of all of that, but at the end, to never lose your voice. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Okay. Thank you. Julia.